My name is Noor Ghadanfar, and I am the Director of Campus Engagement for MIT Arab Alumni Association and the co-chair for MIT TechArabia. We're so excited to have you join us. And I have the honor and the privilege of introducing our first speaker, His Excellency Dr. Omar Razzaz. He is the former Prime Minister of Jordan. His career is diverse and spans the public sector, the private sector, non-governmental organizations, think tanks, international organizations, and academia. Before becoming prime minister, he held several positions in government and in policy institutions in Jordan. He served as Minister of Education between 2017 and 2018. He was also the Director General of Jordan's Social Security Corporation between 2006 and 2010. Dr. Razzaz also served as the chairman of the board of Jordan and as chairman of Jordan's Ahli Bank. In addition to his work in Jordan, Dr. Razzaz also worked at the World Bank in various positions and regions and was country manager of the World Bank in Lebanon between 2002 and 2006. Before that, Dr. Razzaz was the fourth chair assistant professor at MIT in International Development and Regional Planning Program between 1991 and 1993 and 1995 to 1997. Dr. Razzaz holds a master's degree in urban and regional planning from MIT, a PhD in planning from Harvard University with a minor in economics, and a postdoctorate from Harvard Law School. And with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Razzaz onto stage.
Hello, everybody. I'm so delighted and honored to be the keynote speaker. I'm usually not used to do keynote speaking without standing and looking people in the eye, having eye-to-eye contact. But well, this is the world we live in, and my understanding is that technology is evolving so that actually with Zoom you can look at the screen, but kind of be looking eye to eye somehow. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I'm looking forward to that. If I may claim that MIT has taught us two main things. Questioning is one thing, and imagining is another. These are very, very different from each other, and we need both of them badly these days at the regional level and at the global level as well. Questioning is something I really, they hammered down when I was a master's student. They hammered down on us. It was questioning concepts, questioning assumptions, questioning what we took as, for given. I remember being the professor saying, so what is, you're in the international development program, what is development? And each of us thought, what a silly question. We know what development is. But then when you start talking about it, you realize that, somebody said development is change, and said change towards what? What kind of aim? So really just hammering down these questions that a lot of people use terms and then not really explain what they mean. And in that sense, and related to the theme, one of the main themes, sustainability. We really need to hammer this down and question, what is sustainability? It's not as obvious as sometimes it appears. And I think by questioning and asking speakers to be very specific, we get progress through this process. I think personally that we know what is not sustainable more than we know what is sustainability, sort of. So if you have an aquifer and you're pulling water more than your water coming in, that's not sustainable. Okay. But defining sustainability over what term and for whom, and are there winners and losers? What would it take to be fully sustainable? Do we need to be fully sustainable in certain areas? Take oil and gas, for instance. 20 years ago, we thought oil and gas are gonna sort of disappear in 2050, and that's gonna be a big disaster. Well, The world exited the Stone Age not because there were no more stones, because we got into something better, the Bronze Age. And now I think we're doing the same thing with solar and wind and other forms of energy. So, so a lot of our sustainability questions need to be addressed that way, um, through questioning. Now we come to imagining. Imagining is very different, almost the opposite of questioning. Questioning is you're looking at the assumptions and tweaking as a result. Imagining is very different. It starts from the end. You're imagining something that people think is stupid, is unrealizable, is obvious, is this, is that, and and nonetheless, you are imagining that and working backwards from that imagined situation to something um, that can be pulled together. And I remember one of the books that we were forced to read at MIT very early on is called Structure of Scientific Evolution by Thomas Kuhn, if you remember or if you've come across it. Thomas Kuhn basically is a philosopher of science who looked at the history of science and said, what you think about how science evolves is not true. It's not incremental marginal changes when science keeps evolving. That's sort of true. And then, but every now and then there is a real leap. Um, and that, so if you look at the history of science, there are these leaps in undoing of our understanding and then moving on. He's the one who came up with the term paradigm shift. By the way, we use it all the time. I don't know how many people you know that Kuhn is the one who came up with it, in a sense, and saying, look, we make certain, we think we understand the world, and then somebody uh, finds that there's a finding or an invention, and it takes us somewhere else completely. And I really, really think we live in a day-to-day with the elephant in the room, climate change. And increasingly, and the head of the UN talks about not climate change, but climate catastrophe as something transformative, and we have to think outside the box. We have to use both our questioning and also our imagining in that sense. And I can't, MIT students are blessed to have had the type of training that would allow them to do that. And if you allow me, I'll just go very quickly through two um, dimensions, if you will, of questioning and imagining. One is science and technology, and a lot of you are already doing that, either by making tweaks to existing technology, whether it's material science, batteries, solar systems, etc. And that's happening, and that's extremely important. Or by creating paradigm shifts. And a lot of what we know today about climate change might be very, very different in 5 years or 10 years, for the better or the worse. We might discover that it's actually solvable with technology. And let me give you an example of the Malthusian theory, which was very, very common in 18th and 19th century. Malthus was a mathematician who looked at population growth and looked at agricultural production growth, and said that, look, population growth, especially with control of disease, is exponential, while agricultural growth is linear. So sooner or later, we're going to come to a point where there is starvation. And because of that, we need to do something, severe limitation on population growth or something like that. But that's the reality. And for like 100 years, this was taken to be the threat, existential threat that that humanity faces. Well, um, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, we saw the agricultural revolution. Um, Machinery, improved productivity, better seeds, all that stuff resulted in more exponential agricultural production, and socioeconomic changes reduced fertility, population growth, because women increasingly entered the labor market. So it was not what people thought in the 18th and 19th century that was going to solve it. It was something completely different. Innovation, technology, science on one side, and socioeconomic changes on the other side. So this is an example of uh, paradigm shifts where how we define the problem and how we solve it can shift dramatically over time. And maybe we can imagine a world in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years where CO2 emissions are not an issue, not because we've been able to sort of take the tough measures to control CO2 emission, but because somebody's come up with a way to completely extract it from our atmosphere. Uh, and so and you know better than I do what the various technological innovations and the promises of it. There's the whole thing of carbon capture, green cement, um, low methane production by cows, hopefully by human beings at at some point as well. Hydroponic agriculture that already exists, but kind of ships being energized by hydro movements in water surface. These are topics I know nothing about, but I read titles every now and then, and I say, wow, maybe this will help in the future. So this is happening, and you guys are best positioned to keep pushing the limits of everything: batteries, systems, technologies, materials, etc. And that's all under the science and technology kind of dimension. The other dimension, though, that is extremely, extremely important, and I would like to spend a bit of time on, is institutions. Human beings have historically built institutions to address their needs. And by institutions, just to be, I'm not talking about organizations, about corporations. Yes, these are types of institutions, but generally in economics and in institutional economics, they talk about laws, rules, norms, behaviors, and implementation, and how people are affected by it and how they change it. And people are doing that all the time to address their needs. So we have governance structures as institutions that evolve over time, and there are. I can talk forever about this, but just to give you a few examples, the nation state itself, what we see now as the norm, there are countries that are around the world, as you know, is not an ancient phenomena. It's around a couple of hundred years old. It started in Europe. There were empires around the world, and empires broke down into nation states. And there were reasons for that, to internalize externalities and kind of create geographical boundaries that among people who are sort of coherent, they speak relatively, know each other, languages, etc. So the conflict can be minimized to an extent possible. Of course, colonialists created their own boundaries and completely violated that. But even with that, largely the world has survived and created these nation states. Just so that's an example. Another example is the UN. UN is around 75 years old, and it was created because there were World War I and World War II, and we were realizing that this is not sustainable. So the world created, and far from perfect, but an institution that would allow countries to sort of negotiate settlements rather than go to war. Today is a time when we see that it's not being effective in the Ukraine, Russia, let alone the Israel-Palestine question, which was historically a major failure of the UN and the world. Um, but so these are institutions that we create. ضمان الاجتماعي, social security, which is something I was involved in, was created by Bismarck. And the reason for that was to internalize an externality, but people were myopic by nature. They didn't save for their old age. So Bismarck created an obligatory system where you take some of the um, paycheck and put it in a saving that pays for people once they're retired. So there are lots of examples of institutions that solve short-term problems and long-term problems. Now, climate change is a is a vast change on the institutions we have around the world. It's a vast challenge in many ways. Why? Because for the last 200 years, the challenges that a country faced were mostly internal and maybe militaristic. You needed to defend your borders against your enemies on the outside. But other than that, it was internal. With climate change, CO2 emissions, etc., it's creating a global phenomena that requires global institutions. And the institutions we have today were not designed for that. The UN is a governance structure, an institution with membership by sovereign states, which willingly come in and participate. And they can, but there's nothing obligatory, and there's nothing binding. And that's why when we see the Paris Agreement, we see pledges. Pledges means I'm willing to do X and Y as a country. But anybody who studies institutional economics, collective action problem, externalities, free ridership, prisoner's dilemma, these are all types of failures when people come together. You always think, okay, let somebody else do the heavy lifting. See, why should I do anything about it? There are 4 or 5 countries around the world that do most of it, of the CO2 emissions. So, don't talk to me about sacrifices we need to do. And you get a country like China that says, look, we've just joined the developed world, so you can't impose too many things on us. So you get these pledges, but again and again and again, we fall short of these pledges. And I really think we need to start imagining. We need to start imagining a different institution, a different global institution that represents the global collective good. And that applies to everything. You can't impose a carbon tax or a carbon credit without having some authority to do that on a global level. You need to have accounting of who's taking away from the environment and who's giving into the environment. And you need to take history in consideration. That has to do with what you guys are, one of the topics you're discussing, social justice and sustainability. It's not sustainable to have systems that continue to make richer countries richer and poorer countries poorer, or richer people under poorer people within the same country. And this is a vast area that I personally am interested in and I'm working on of investigation. How can we create structural responses in an institutional setting to problems we face now? The interesting part about it is, so we have two dimensions. One is science and technology, and one is institutions. Now, science and technology might come up with a solution that makes all of the stuff on the institutional level irrelevant and not needed. So in 5 years, if somebody finds a way to deal with CO2 and other global problems, then we don't need institutional reform. However, the risk is so high that we can't just sit back and say, okay, let's hope science does it because it has to do with the Earth's existence in this world. So, so it's very serious, and we have to go along both dimensions. One is to create the kind of institutions, and one is to create the incentives, the laws, the regulations that allow the technological and scientific leapfrogs and paradigm shifts and tweaking to keep going. One of the very interesting things I'm looking at now is, in terms of institutional design, is game theory. So game theory has like the three games that they look at and how to respond to them. So let's take the first game. It's not a game, it's very serious, but it's an asteroid hitting Earth with major implications. What's the best institutional design to deal with that? How do you get countries to respond to an asteroid hitting Earth? If it's a very small asteroid, then you know it this happens and hopefully it hits the water, the ocean. If it's a major asteroid, then the question is how do you get, what's the most efficient way of responding to it? And game theory suggests that if the best way to do it is a single best actor. So the United States, for instance, is scientifically, materially very well positioned through NASA and others to prepare the response, to create the rocket that will hit that asteroid and take care of it. So you have one actor who's acting on behalf of the whole world, mainly because it's going to be affected. So it has the tools and it's going to be affected. And it says, okay, look, I'm going to do it. I'll take care of it myself. There are negative repercussions to that or ways to repay that actor. But it's relatively, in game theory terms, it's a simple game. Let's take another global risk, not the asteroid, but COVID. COVID is a global public not good, global public bad, and we have seen how the world has responded in some good ways, but in very bad ways as well, like hoarding the vaccine, as if that's going to save the world. This is a game theory in which you need it's called the weakest link. In this, if you don't have every country participating, then you risk not getting the public bad addressed or the public good realized. So if you have in COVID, if you have one or two or five countries in Africa, for instance, who aren't able to do the vaccination, both because of supply chain and infrastructure and the vaccine itself, it doesn't help the world. It's as if you have done nothing because it becomes a breeding ground for COVID or for other future pandemics. So you need every single country to be on board in that structure so that you can deal with the public threat. The third game and the last one that is discussed is like the climate change, the CO2 emission. Now, CO2 emission, if we look at 4 or 5 biggest emitters in the world, they account for, I think, I can't remember the number, but like 70%, I think, of total CO2 emissions are by 5 countries. So this is a case, it's called the club game, where you can get 5, 6 countries together to agree and solve the whole problem on behalf or sort of 80% of the problem, rather than having 120 countries agreeing to. So there's a lot to be done. And every time you think about this super global structure, people will say, no, 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 this is not going to work. Maybe not. Maybe it's very difficult. Maybe it's difficult to bring these types of scenarios and put them under a nested governance system that has national government, local government, regional authorities, especially related to water, because water isn't as global as air and CO2. But this is the global challenge, the human challenge that we are facing these days, and it's a significant one. So that all of this takes us to the question of where do we go from here at a regional level and at a global level? And I really think that this is the time to be questioning all the assumptions we've had, including globalization. Globalization was um, sort of talked about as what's a historical period that everybody's going to benefit from. Yes, but if every time there is food shortage or there is vaccine shortage, rich countries hoard, then we don't know what the globalization is all about. The same applies to a lot of other concepts. Technology-wise, science-wise, I'm a spectator. I'm not involved in any of that. But I'm amazed at what innovation is able to produce. Just looking at the list of um, events you have, we can look at them from both the science, technology, as well as the institution. Take energy, for instance, oil and gas. Okay, the literature until, well, maybe even now, talk about the curse of resources, because if you have oil and gas, take Venezuela for instance, Nigeria and Africa, the more resources, natural resources you have, the more unstable your governance structures tend to be. And the reason is, it's a whole literature about that. But oil and gas um, is uh, can be a curse if you're not managing that wealth well. But Norway has managed it extremely well by creating an institution, by creating a fund, an intergenerational fund, where oil and gas are used and the benefits of them are spread across generations to come. So in many ways, I don't see that um, as a curse, natural resource curse, but as a benefit because you have the right institutions. So my question to our region, to countries in the south of Jordan, where that are rich with oil and gas, but clearly, at least as far as we know, in 30, 40 years, it's not going to be an important resource in the world's access to energy. And countries like Jordan and Morocco and Tunisia that don't have oil and gas, but have very rich solar and wind energy sources. So how do we complement each other? How do we create the regional structure that helps us transition both in positive terms and getting over the negativities of that CO2 emissions, etc. These are all very important questions, and I'd love to see, and I will check in the various parts of the discussion. What are the innovations technologically on the energy front, but also institutionally to incentivize? In Jordan, for example, we're still not using water very efficiently. And what we need is not just the heavy infrastructure, the national uh, the national water transmission from Aqaba to the rest of the country, but we need to do a lot on the agricultural practices, and the kind of fruits and vegetables uh, that we plant. Um, in data, data is so important on both front. You need data to do your questioning and building your models, but also data is very important in governance and in institutions, because only then can you have proper accounting, and only then can you be transparent to the public who wants to see what is it that you're doing actually, and only then can the public hold you accountable as governments and as global structure. This is why we see now the blah 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 term about what governments say, because governments make these pledges, but then the reporting on it is quite weak. So data in this is essential. Social justice, as we said, um, you can't just brush away the inequalities globally and regionally and locally and say, okay, look, we're just going to focus on climate change. That's not sustainable. We know what's not sustainable. Making the poor poorer and the rich richer, and say that's not going to last. And we see the riots today in Sri Lanka and elsewhere about prices, and this is going to happen. So um, social justice, data access, transparency, energy innovations. I might have, but lots of things that are being discussed, like circular economy, accounting, carbon tax, carbon credits. All of these require major institutions. I will stop here because I would like to. I don't know whether there is a question answer time um, or access to it, but I would really love to hear from you. And my last call is keep pushing, keep questioning, and keep imagining. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Razzaz, for that very insightful talk. I love how you weaved in institutions, technology, innovation, and really realizing the role that each of them is important. And you can't have just one or just put all your eggs in one basket. Completely agree. I have a couple of questions from our attendees, which I will read to you. And then I'll go off camera. And once you're done answering, I can come back on and we'll go to the next question. Okay. Our first question says, "Thank you, Omar, for the stimulating talk. From your wide experience in public office and policy making, and now that you're an ex-prime minister, could you give a candid view of how you see the Arab world's ability to realize the issue of equity and sustainability in the face of the region's socio-political realities?" We're starting off with an easy one.
We'll take one question at a time. Yeah?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Listen. Now that I'm out, I can talk a little bit less diplomatically about things. Um, the structures we have at the level of the Arab world are incredibly ineffective. جامعة الدول العربية, the uh, is a dysfunctional one. Even, I mean, we're talking about the UN being sort of, it's not binding. This is definitely not binding and definitely not effective. We take water, for example. Water is a regional issue, not a global issue. Or it is, but a global issue. But the main issues we need to address are regional ones. Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Syria, the Furat to Dejla are gonna run down out of water. I mean, we need Turkey and Iran on this one. Very weak, very disappointing structure. Trade in the Arab world is, we trade with each other less than we trade with the world, much less than we trade with the world. Labor migration itself related to wars, etc. Jordan has, and maybe Lebanon, and have borne the brunt of that. And so anything that is beyond national level, we have. I want to be. I want to say totally failed at it. So I think nothing short of more citizen participation and holding governments accountable is going to get us to where we need
Dr.
to
Ahmed is just
be.
having some technical issues, so I'm just
I'm
popping in.
sure.
The other question we had is from Hadil Khzouz. Thank you for your great speech, Your Excellency. You have mentioned multiple milestones in different sectors, technological, social, environmental. Nowadays, third world countries are still behind in this development. Therefore, referring to your experience as a former prime minister in Jordan, what are the main pillars required and needed to lead our countries into this development process?
What are the what? Sorry.
What are the main pillars required and needed to lead our countries into this development process?
Um, Thank you. Again, a very good question. And my experience in the public sector, in the private sector, and in the international organizations, I have come to be a very strong believer in institutions. Um, Institutions are not a one-man show. It's not about a brilliant leader who sees everything that we don't. And, I mean, we're seeing these types of, one-man shows are very, very risky for the future, but just simply because nobody's perfect. Anybody who thinks they know everything about everything and they don't need advisors or they need yes men around them are taking their countries into very risky scenarios. And we see it at a global level. I don't know how you feel. People feel differently about Russia, Ukraine, etc. But I'm talking personally. I think institutions that disclose information are transparent in their disclosure about their economic performance, this fiscal informant, about the environment, about socioeconomic numbers, disclose them, engage with people, listen, get feedback on your policy, see what you're doing wrong and what you're doing right, tweak what you're doing right, improve it, expand it, and examine what you're doing wrong, and have real accountability. That's why I think in Jordan, what if this process of um, uh, governments that are elected and held accountable continues, and I hope it does, and every indication shows, then we will move towards a not a very easy road, but a very bumpy road, but towards accountable governments and changing in governments as in terms of their performance. So so that it's not easy. It's not straightforward. There is no cookbook with the recipe for how to do it, but I think we need to build institutions, and a lot of our countries did not have institutions. They were one man show. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Nice, for stepping in when my internet was acting up. The next question is, I think, a very interesting one from Bashar Hamoudeh. Question to His Excellency Dr. Omar Razzaz. Why has Jordan been lagging in the fight and action towards climate change? And if you have the chance to go back and relive your role as Prime Minister, what's one thing you think you would change in order for Jordan to act against climate change?
I wish I could sort of have a conversation with Bashar rather than حتى أفهم, so that I get a better understanding of what he means by that. If because climate change, we were just, we need to define is exactly what we're talking about. If we're talking about CO2 emissions, then Jordan can do stuff. To me, and again, I'm not an expert here. I'm a consumer of your knowledge and innovations. Um, so maybe we could do more on the quality of gasoline and the quality and but we have a fact. We have long-term contracts with oil producers that affect the quality of gasoline down the line. But my understanding is recently we've been kind of tightening, if you will, the regulations on our main local company that produces oil and gas to reduce um, the emissions that are dangerous. But so that's on this on one side. As I said, I think the major issue in Jordan is water, and unfortunately, if you look at water sources for Jordan, other than rainfall, which is affected by the climate, it's mostly riparian issues across political boundaries. So the Jordan River involves us and Israel and Palestine. The Yarmouk River involves us and Syria. The aquifers in the south are shared with Saudi Arabia. Unless we have a a understanding on how to share those, and that is binding, where every side is just gonna act. It's free ridership. You know, it becomes a race to who takes more water and up takes more water upstream. So the solution for that is going to be political, not environmental.
Yeah, extremely interesting answer. I think regional collaboration is a key to a lot of the issues that we're facing as a region.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is from Ahmed Bassam. His Excellency Dr. Omar, how do you see the climate action in the region playing a role in sustainable development of the region? And how can that support refugees since we have such a large percentage of refugees in the Middle East and North America all across?
Yeah. Thank you, Ahmed. Focus on the refugees because, in a sense, and the ramifications of that on the environment. Um, I'd like to think of the refugee issue as a global public good because we've experienced it because of the instability in the region, mainly recently in Syria, but before that in Iraq and in Palestine and elsewhere. And Jordan has paid the brunt. When you're already a water scarce country, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, Jordan is probably the most poor country in terms of water per capita, 70 cubic centimeters per day, compared to the minimum of 100, I think, by the UN. To add insult to injury and get a 1.3 million refugees, how are you going to get your water resources allocated, let alone education and health, etc. Yet, Jordan did what is the right thing to do in terms of morally and humanly, and accommodated the refugees. Now, the question, going back to institutions, is what is the message that the world is sending to countries that open their doors to refugees? Is it, you're on your own? And if it is, you're on your own. And if we see climate change effects in many countries with droughts and other natural catastrophes, the question in Africa is, should the country next door open its borders, or should it build a huge fence, electric fence, that prevents people from crossing and let people die? That's a global governance question. And if you want countries to open their doors and open their arms, then you have to have not just come in when refugees are coming in and say, okay, here are some 100 million, $300 million there. but really build the type of once you accept refugees, 70% of them are never going to leave the country they're in. So it's not just about the emergency accommodation, it's about how do you take care of these families for the next 20 years as they require uh, assistance and education and health, etc. Short of a global fund, as part of the governance structure that we were talking about, that would say, okay, if you open your doors, then the world will come to help you, because any of us can be ultimately a victim. So essentially, it's insurance, it's pooling of our risk. Unless we do that, we will have cases like what we're seeing now. And in fact, in a talk I had a few weeks ago at Harvard, I said, you know, I salute Poland for opening its doors to Ukrainian refugees. It's really, I mean, it reminds me of what we did. Just no questions asked, open up. But I really hope that the world will stay committed to these refugees and develop programs to help countries that have done that before.
I'm back again. She's having some
Hi,
trouble
Mazi.
today. Hi, Doctor. So we have one last question.
Uh-huh.
Dr. Razzaz from Sarah Simon. These points are excellent. An issue discussed recently is the finding that the world's carbon impact is now more connected to um, where is it? To extreme wealth of some individuals rather than nation states. Is there a game theory solution that could be applied to the challenge of wealth and excess energy consumption, with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas in the air or hearing more voices? Perhaps some institution solutions that could work in MENA or globally.
Thank you, Sarah. And if I would love that reference, I would love to see that reference. If you can send it to me by email or some other ways. My email is with Maith and Noor, and available to all of you. I would love to read it. In that, look, the people don't you know شو المثل اللي عندنا كله عند العرب صابون احيانا. We don't distinguish between different philosophies um, uh, on um, on wealth distribution and the responsibility of the state. Since the 80s, the whole world has suffered actually from a theory of neoliberalism that basically advocated that the state should stay out of everything. Let the private sector done that, and then it will be wealth distribution, the trickle-down effect, etc. This was basically the Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan approach, and it survived. It survived at least until the 2008, 2008, with the collapse of the financial markets. The idea that the state should stay out, and that's the best thing that can do. Now, that's impossible, and it's not just impossible. It's false to think that markets work without institutions. You need laws and regulations, and you need incentives and disincentives and what have you to create those markets. And we know that in the last 20, 30 years, the 1% got much richer, and the lower income became much poorer. Um, and and this was the assumption that the world has infinite resources. And now we're seeing that the world doesn't have infinite resources, and the world is not. The outcomes are not fair in terms of, and we can't claim that there is equality in the sense that it is we have free opportunity, equal opportunity for المساواة بالفرص. ما في مساواة بالفرص. We don't have equal opportunity because educational outcomes are affected by the wealth of the parents. This is well documented in everywhere. So we're not even putting children at equal footing. I'll tell you about Jordan. About 40% or 50% of our children don't go to pre-K. And if you don't go to pre-K, it affects your learning throughout, let alone your sense of inferiority when you go to grade 1 to first grade, and there is a kid next to you who's been to pre-K for 2 years, knows letters, numbers, colors, knows how to draw, and you don't. And it immediately puts in you a sense that I'm not as good as him, or I'm not as good as her. And then, and that gap isn't, there's evidence says it's not bridged. So we can't just pretend that all is fine. We do have to get to a much fairer world system going forward.
And with that, I would just like to thank Dr. Razzaz so much for taking the time out of your schedule. I know you're in the States, and joining us today and joining all the attendees and answering questions. I think this was really illuminating, and we really appreciate how candid you are now that you're out of office and you're able to answer things more freely. So truly, thank you so much, Dr. Razzaz. It's been an honor to have you as part of this conference. We hope to see you in the other sessions as well.
It's a privilege, Noor, and everybody else that's here. I have many of you are friends, but I can't see you, and I'll try to push the buttons down at the bottom so that I can see more of my friends. And I really, being at MIT is a privilege. Having been at MIT is a huge privilege. Let's use that privilege for making good. Thank you.
Thank you so much.